Cabin trips are supposed to be simple: a road, a bottle of wine, and a few nights under unfamiliar stars. Tonight's 6 stories are about cabins where the stars did more than watch. They witnessed something else. These are true-style accounts adapted and edited for clarity. Don't listen alone. I'm writing this in the gloom of an office lamp because daylight makes memory feel safer, and the night remembers everything it was taught to keep. We'd been friends since high school, 5 of us who, for reasons that seemed like character building at the time, swore to meet once a year at cabins. That year we rented a rundown place on the edge of what a map called Birch Lake. The listing said secluded, in a way the internet thought was romantic. The place sat off a bumpy logging road, a leaning porch, a dock that sagged at the far end. Maya was the one who suggested the lake. She liked the way water made her slow down. She liked the ritual of midnight walks with no speaker, no schedule. The first night was perfect in the way that makes you forgive the chipped mugs and thin mattresses of fire, boxed wine, and stupid dares about who would go skinny dipping first. Around 1, the group filtered off to bed. The porch light clicked and the world thinned to the sound of frogs and a metronome of far traffic. At 2:03 a.m., I woke because the moon on the water looked wrong. It was too bright and jagged, and there was a thin light moving across the far shore, like someone carrying a candle and pacing under tree cover. My first thought was that it was Maya. She liked to walk, and when I stepped onto the porch, I saw her silhouette already at the dock's tip, a small headlamp hanging useless at her belt. She stood very still and watched the far tree line the way someone watches a screen. I called out soft, "Maya!" Her voice came back, close and hollow. "There's someone down there." The tone in her voice made the sill of fear tilt inside me. She'd been drinking but wasn't stupid. Sometimes the lake plays sound tricks with voices. Sometimes a hunter is walking his dog. I should have trusted the small, rational things. I didn't. We walked down the dock together. The water smelled of mud and old summer. The night was a black sheet, and the only sound was the dock complaining under our weight. At the far edge, where the boards gave way to algae, there was nothing, and Maya's name sometimes gets mangled in memory because my brain wants to keep a different version, said, "I think there's a light on the other side. Someone's up there." Her voice was thin with that curious excitement that mixes with fear. We went back to bed and tried to be normal. The next morning, we joked as if we meant it, sat around cheap coffee, and pulled on damp sweaters. Maya was quiet but made jokes about seeing someone from a ghost movie. Around noon, she said she wanted to walk down to the far path to pick blackberries she liked for breakfast jam. She took only the little things: a pocket knife, her phone, and the habit of threading grass between her fingers when she walked. She kissed me on the cheek like she always did, a peck, a small punctuation, and left at 12:32 by my watch. When she didn't return by 2 o'clock, we started to look. The trail was narrow and wound into trees. The brush was wet with overnight and my shoes felt heavy. We called her name until my throat thinned. We found her phone near the blackberry patch screened, cracked like someone's idea of art. My hands shook when I picked it up and saw the lock screen. My smiling face from under a tree the night before. Stubborn little digital artifacts of being together. We followed the path along the far shore and then found signs that made my stomach drop like a weight. There were prints in the mud that didn't match our boots. Small, close together, as if whoever wore them had been trying to be light. There were scrapes on the bark where someone had dragged their hand. Then there was the oddest thing. The dock's far end had been moved slightly, not enough to topple, but enough that the planks were misaligned and wet underneath. Hours turned into organized search windows. Trucks calling the sheriff, drones later on. We had images, thermal pings that found little heat signatures near the marsh, and then nothing. They found a few things left behind. A scrap of scarf caught on a reed, a single earring wedged in a rock crevice, a half-mushed blackberry. Nothing that could tell us whether Maya had left on foot, been carried, or had simply walked into the water. Weeks of investigation brought theories and not much else. One ranger had a map of old logging crew camps and noted offhand that decades earlier there had been camps across at the North Inlet where itinerant people sometimes sheltered. Others hypothesized a foolish thrill, maybe she'd followed the light and met someone. Some people said she walked into a place that expects foot traffic and stayed because it had rules she hadn't learned yet. Months later, My sister, insomniac and obsessive, found a grainy, blown photo on a hiking blog of a doe at the far shore taken at 2:17 a.m. You can see a little spark of candlelight beyond the trees then, a blur like a face half seen. The blog poster swore it was a camera trap for wildlife. The photo sat next to other pictures of distant couples kissing and fishing hooks. It made no sense. Here's the horrible, intimate part. I am now someone who checks door hinges when I get up at 2 a.m. I have a superstition that if you leave a light on in certain rooms, they will remember you are not a stranger. We moved from the cabin after not sleeping for weeks. I still visit the lake sometimes with a small flashlight and a stupid notion that seeing the dock aligned, the boards right, will fix the faint warp in memory. The truth is rancid and simple. The world is not obligated to return what it takes. When you lose someone to a night that has a mind of its own, you live with the possible reasons and build your life around them like scaffolding. We still leave Maya's place empty in our group photos. We do it to remind ourselves that one year can end differently. Cabins remember who leaves the light on and who doesn't come back. We'd both grown up around houses whose walls had small histories. Thumbprints in plaster, pencil marks from measuring height. The idea of a wall hiding something always felt like an evil fable until the cottage we rented for a weekend proved otherwise. We found the cabin on a rental site. The host called it rustic charm. It had old, thick pine walls, the kind that smell like months of wood smoke and last summer's laundry. I went with my brother, Ben, and our partners for a birthday weekend. The first afternoon, while I was stomping around making firewood feel like an art, Ben found a thin seam in the living room wall behind an old bookcase. It was one of those seams that hides nothing important, or so we thought. The kind of seam a curious kid would investigate and then forget. At sunset, the seam looked like a shadow. The bookcase had been pushed away as if someone had leaned on it 100 times. Ben joked about secret rooms in Victorian houses, and we laughed and drank more beer than we needed to. That night, the wind was loud and the fire complained in small pieces. Sometime after midnight, my partner Michelle, names wander in my head, woke me up because something sounded like nails on wood. She listened for a long time and said matter-of-factly, "There's scratching in the wall." I laughed because laughter is the reflex you use since it buys time, and I told her it was probably an old mouse. She said, "I don't think mice scratch like that." We slept fitfully. At 3 a.m., I woke again to real human noise. Deliberate, slow scrapes as if someone was pushing something heavy along the inside of the wall. I slipped out of the duvet and crept to the living room. The bookcase sat like an honest man in the lamplight. The seam Ben had found earlier showed a hairline of raw plaster dust where something had been pushed. I prodded the wood with my hand and felt a small give a panel that had been pried. Ben woke and we told him. He shrugged and said he'd been up earlier and had felt the same thing but assumed it was the house settling. The house settling does not make the sound of pressure against wood like a throat about to speak. The next morning, we investigated. Lifting the bookcase revealed a thin board cleverly nailed in. Screws rusted in a way that suggested removal and replacement many times. Under the board was a cavity the width of an old person and the depth of a broom closet. Inside, someone had built a small nest, a flattened blanket, a handful of folded magazines, and a little tin with match heads. Someone had been using it as a place to lie low. We brought this to the host's attention. He looked embarrassed and said he'd once known a transient who used to shelter in outbuildings and crawl spaces in winter. He said he'd thought the place secure. The conversation ended with him promising to inspect and to reimburse us for the weekend because who wants to stay in a place filled with other people's night routines? Here's where it turned stranger. When he pried further, deeper behind the cavity wall, he found scratches not made by nails but by something with intention, an alphabet of tiny vertical lines and dots etched into the inside of the panel. Someone had been trying to make words. The scratches formed shapes like an incomplete M, then a series of dots, then another letter. Whoever had been there had been trying to communicate, perhaps on the off chance someone would find the interface of the wall. We called the police because you call the police when you find someone's living room inside your wall. They took photos, put on gloves, and told us it was probably someone experiencing homelessness. That common, crushing answer hangs between lines of empathy and annoyance in a policeman's voice. They dusted for prints and came back with partials and smudges. Nothing led to a person. Before we left, the host offered to remove the interior panel and search the studs. When he pulled the panel, something fell out and hit the floor with a soft, papery thump. It was a newspaper clipping from the regional paper dated 15 years earlier about a child who went missing for a week and was found wandering scared on a highway. Someone had used the clipping to line the makeshift nest. On top of it sat a small, crude carving of a hand, fingers outstretched, made of soft cedar. The hand had a notch cut into the thumb like a mark. We all felt small standing in the little dusted opening where someone had been living and making marks. The notch on the thumb, whether a prank or a ritual, felt like a signature. The host later admitted that before renovations, an elderly woman had once told him there was always someone in the nooks of the older houses. They like the warm, empty places, she'd said. Whether a person had once made the house into a home or someone had been living there recently, the details hurt the same way. We left early. When the host removed the entire inner wall to repair the studs, he found nothing more living, no bones, no real person. He said the scratch marks were too faint to be translated into meaning. He made offers of reimbursement and apology and the kind of civilian reparations that look small against the fact of personal violation. I came away with a new superstitious habit. I check behind furniture now, not because I expect to find anything, but because the idea that someone could secretly keep themselves in the warm hollow of a home makes the world not quite fit. The scratch marks stay in my head like an itch. Someone tried to speak from behind plaster and was never heard. Old walls keep old secrets, and sometimes someone else's home. We thought the generator would save the world. It was a storm weekend. The forecast had been dramatic in that dispassionate, spreadsheet way: wind gusts 60 plus, fallen branches likely. The cabin we rented was at the top of a ridge with a generator promised in the host notes. Runs off propane, reliable. And we were smug about being prepared. It's a small arrogance to plan for storms. It makes you feel like you understand the weather. We were two couples and an extra friend who'd driven in late and crashed on the futon. The storm arrived in earnest around midnight. A wall of wind and rain like the sky decided to rearrange itself. At 1:17 a.m. the power blinked, then died. Inside the cabin the radio hiccuped and surrendered. We flipped on flashlights and the generator started with a mechanical cough and then a steady human sound. The living room lamp came alive and the rats of rain against the windows became a drum. We joked about how primitive it was to be at the end of a storm that left everything modern in our hands a little useless. We lit candles, moved board games to the coffee table, and listened to the storm do what storms do. Around 2:03, the generator coughed and died like it had been expecting another voice. Lights cut and the house went to a shape it knew, intimately dark, muffled, full of water sound. We had planned for this moment and then not planned for the dark. Someone went to check the generator and called, "It's out of propane." We are a certain sort of people who handle logistics badly in emergency mood. We wrapped blankets around ourselves and laughed hollowly. The radio had a small battery with local AM and the DJ's voice sounded like someone speaking in an empty subway. The first small thing I noticed was the window at the kitchen table. A tapping sound, shallow and polite, like someone testing whether anyone inside was awake. The taps were precise: tap, pause, tap like a code that wanted to be read. We thought of branches. We thought of the old raccoons with delicate paws. But then the sound changed: 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, and the pattern repeated. I stood up and crept to the window. Rain had smeared the glass, but I could see a clean patch where something had been wiping the pain from the outside. A faint smear made a line of wet across the glass. No branch could have made that. I called, "Hello," felt ridiculous. There was no answer, only the tapping rhythm. I went outside with the largest flashlight and walked the perimeter. The ground was worked into a muddy carpet, and the storm had beaten everything low. Near the dining window, the leaves had been pushed aside into a neat arc, and in that arc were 3 shallow impressions like the sole of a child's shoe. They headed away from the house towards the tree line and then stopped at a small rise where the ground had been trampled. Then nothing. We called the shore guard on a battery phone, and they told us to stay inside until someone could drive up the road. They said someone had been sighted 2 evenings earlier, a person who enjoyed wandering and followed cabin lights. The line said, "Stay with your group. Secure your windows." We waited and tried to be brave, making soup and checking the locks. The tapping came again at 2:42 a.m., now at the bedroom window. It was close enough that the sound vibrated the panes like someone pressing a cane. The tapping had a rhythm that matched part of old carnival music. My mind tries to put things into containers so it can shut the lid. Then something else happened. A soft rapping at the door and a voice. "Quiet. Is anyone home?" The voice was small and oddly high. I swear to you now, I thought for a second that the person might be a child needing help, especially in a storm. My partner stepped near the door and said loudly, "We are," as if a loud answer would scare away a help-seeking stranger. The voice said, "Please, help me." And then there was a pause and a soft laugh, like a breath pulled between teeth. I unbolted another deadbolt and peered cautiously through the peephole. There was nothing there but rain and the smear of a footprint leading away from the steps. The idea of someone who could walk among the rain and become invisible to the peephole is a kind of cruelty you do not want to meet. We waited until the Coast Guard bloke could make it up in the morning. He came like someone emerging from the night with a flashlight and a heavy truck. He found no one sleeping in the treeline but did find subtle signs. Flattened grass piled in a small ring like a makeshift seat, and a line of old pennies spread in a half-circle that looked like someone's ritual or a child's collection. The pennies were dull and small. Leather had embedded itself into the metal with age. "Probably a drifter," the Coast Guard said, and he did not sound like he believed it, which made the words worse. He gave us pepper spray and a radio and said to keep the generator maintained. The small, terrifying aftertaste came later. 1 week after the storm, my friend found a faint row of thumbprints on the inside of the kitchen cabinet glass, the sort you get when someone presses their fingers to the inside of a window they can't pass through. It was as if someone had been trying to see inside and then left their mark. We scrubbed and scrubbed. They returned 3 days later, faint as memory. Things that small keep you awake longer than things that are loud. Storms reveal what keeps the dark awake. We went to the cabin because Jenna swore it would make us feel human again. Work had a gravity to it, the kind that pulls your head down, and she wanted us to look at a body of water without immediately snapping a photo. It was a modest place. Cedar siding gone gray in strips, a porch that slumped a little on one corner, and a roofline that hunched like an old dog. The first night was easy. We built a fire with the neighborhood wood left by the host, poured boxed wine that tasted faintly of plastic, and played a card game that made us laugh like we were lighter than we were. The dog Maggie slept at the foot of the bed and snored in a way that made everything feel plausible. At 2 a.m., I woke to the house settling, which is what you learn to call the creaks and sighs when you live in wood. On the second night, the sound was different. It was not the familiar groan of rafters loosening. It came from above us and was unmistakably deliberate. The measured, distant thunk of weight crossing the roof. 3 steps, pause. 3 steps, pause. The pace had a strange cadence, like someone walking while counting. At first, I blamed the dog. Maggie can be dramatic. I remembered that old wives' tale about raccoons walking on the roof and laughed hollowly at myself. I went to the window and peered up into the black. The eaves threw an inky line across the sky. Nothing moved. If anything was out there, it was a silhouette against the stars, and I couldn't make out a shape. We made jokes the next morning about roof squatters. The host recommended some local remedies. Make noise, call the ranger, sleep with the radio on. Felt absurd. Why would someone sleep on a roof? In the daylight, the roof looked like any roof. Moss in the shingles, a vent pipe, and a sagging gutter. The ranger suggested animals. He said it in the way men say things that leave you feeling silly for being afraid. That night, we set a cheap motion camera on the porch aimed toward the overhang, mostly to mock ourselves if footage turned up. The camera was an inexpensive thing, motion-activated, grainy, prone to false positives, but it was a comfort, like a chain around a bad thought. At 3:13 a.m., the camera recorded something that did not match the shape of a raccoon. On the tiny black and white clip, a form moved across the roofline like a person on a low-slung tightrope. It walked in a human 2-step, left foot, right foot, in a rhythm you get when you've learned to move on shingles. The silhouette was odd, not tall, not muscular. It was long-bodied, like a man who had taught himself to fold his head into his shoulders. The figure's stride didn't kick up leaves or scatter debris. The roof stayed clean as if it absorbed his weight. I went outside, barefoot, gripping a flashlight until I felt like my hands might crush it. The air cut the skin like a credit card. The porch creaked as I stepped. The camera footage had ended with the figure pausing at the chimney and shifting something at the vent like someone checking a seam, not like a thief getting in and out. The flashlight beams skimmed smoke where there shouldn't have been any, a faint oily smudge near the shingles. I climbed the ladder because curiosity has the same gravitational pull as stupidity. The roof was cold under my palms. The shingle grit bit into my knees. Halfway up, I found the marked small depressions pressed into the asphalt where something had pushed down and then lifted. In one of the depressions, a small piece of lichen had been peeled back, as if someone had exposed the raw tack of the shingle. And there, lodged in the shingle, a single frayed shoelace tied into a clumsy knot like a message. I took the shoelace and stuffed it in my pocket like you take a pebble from a place you want to remember or forget. In the morning, I tried to laugh it off. Maybe a kid lost it, I told Jenna. She didn't laugh. Maggie wouldn't climb the porch. She stood at the base of the ladder and stared up like someone who knows an eyesore. We kept the camera rolling that night, the cheap box like a sentinel in our porch light. At 1:05 a.m., a figure stepped across the shingles like a soft machine. This time I watched the outline in the live feed, how it moved with an economy that looked practiced. When it paused, the roof light from our neighbor's camper caught a glint on whatever it wore over its head. The glint reflected back at us in the feed like a small flash of silver. For moments that felt like a long decision, the thing stood and then leaned over the roof and slapped something with the flat of its palm. The sound on the tiny speaker was a soft tearing that resembled fabric being smoothed, an oddly domestic noise. I wanted to call the police. I did not. I woke Jenna and we whispered like plotters. We got the truck to circle the perimeter and we tried the archaic method of being loud. The figure either went away or stopped its routine. The next morning, we found more depressions and, closer to the chimney, a scraped patch where someone had worn away the moss like it was a path. There were also new shoelace fragments, small cotton threads like breadcrumbed footprints across a roof. Word got around in that slow way small towns gossip does. 2 neighbors told us they'd had similar noises. You get used to who lives around you, they said, and then added, but not that. They chalked it up to a transient who liked to move at night. A man in the hardware store asked us if we'd ever seen anyone possess a habit of being small in places we felt were private. He called them edge people, as if labeling them let their edges be softer. We tried measures. We strung lights and set the motion camera to alarm. The siren was a useless little thing with the dignity of an apology. 2:08 a.m., the alarm fired. The camera showed a low thing crossing the roof with a gait that had the misfortune of being human. It came close enough to the motion sensor that I could have sworn the device smelled it. When we rushed outside, flashlights punching the dark, the roof was unmarked and quiet. The only trace was the shoelace in my pocket and a wet foam of breath on the air like something that had just been near to a warm body. Months passed. Maggie began to have a quirk where she would not sleep on the bed anymore. She lay by the living room door and growled at the ceiling like a person who knows a story and wants to keep it from being repeated. We moved after a year not because we had proof of a man living on the roof, not because our logic came with a list of things to slap on paper, but because every small thing in the house reminded us of a presence that had no companions. We found later on an online forum a thread from a man who swore he'd seen something like mine on the roof of a neighboring cabin 3 decades before. He wrote about lichen peeled away and shoelaces tied into knots as if that solved anything. I still wake sometimes at 2 a.m. and listen to the long arc of the roof of my apartment. The world has edges. Some of them are meant to stay empty. If you hear heavy, slow steps at night above you, do not assume the worst. Assume only that there are things practiced in the dark that don't belong to any of us. And check your gutters. When someone practices being unseen, the small things tell the story. I'd always envied people who could sit in silence and call it progress. I'm not one of them. My head fills up with small tasks and calendar reminders like a jar jammed with spoons. So, when I inherited the cabin from a great aunt I had only met in photographs, I told myself it would be a place to be quiet in the useful way draft pages, do some thinking, sleep like someone whose hands have been idle. The cabin was small in a kind way. A wood stove with old soot in the door, a trunk full of letters in the attic, and a shelf of tins stamped with the names of tea companies that had closed down. On the first afternoon, I found the trunk and leafed through the letters. They were mostly weather notes and recipes, but tucked between them were notes to someone named Agnes, a life's minutiae recorded in courteous hand. One line read, "The house listens when you call its name." I laughed at that line the way you laugh at a joke told by a family member, but it lodged like a seed you forget you planted. I talked to the cabin the first night like a tourist does. I would mutter into the kitchen, "Okay, house no weird things, no haunted squalls." I meant it half jokingly. The radio on the shelf, an old AM with a worn dial, sat like a prop. When the generator coughed at 1 a.m., the radio kept feeding a distant, irregular song through its poor speaker, and the words made some private sense. The second morning, I woke with a silly annoyance. A bootlace on the kitchen table. Not mine. Not left by any of the neighbors who'd come by to check on me. I remember lifting it and thinking, someone is rude. And then feeling foolish for thinking of rudeness as a category that applies to an empty cabin. I asked the clearing crew and they shrugged. "Wayfarers," they said, as if naming them explained their presence. By the third day, a pattern settled. When I muttered some fear out loud and stupidly into a pillow, my breath would still out in the morning when I opened the curtains. I would find a small sign of reply, a twig placed neatly on the woodpile, a stone on top of a garden marker, a dish moved to the edge of the table. Once I said, half to myself, "If you're here, give me a sign." The next morning, 3 light knocks at the kitchen window met me at dawn. It is easy to rationalize. You tie strings between things and convince yourself you are clever. But the things deepened. I started to notice changes that were more private. My writing pad, my attempt at being serious, had a line in the margin in a pen I hadn't used. The word was my childhood nickname, the one I hadn't said aloud in years. The radio would screech to a certain frequency at 3 a.m. and then stop as if someone had tuned it with a hand I could not see. The scent of pipe tobacco would linger in the corner, though no one in my life smoked. One night, in a fit of hubris, I recorded myself asking the cabin a question. "If you are here, who was the little girl who used to steal bread?" Nothing happened that night that I could perceive. The next morning, the trunk was open and the letters rearranged. Among them lay a scrap with a single line in a hand that looked like my aunt's but somehow sharper. "You asked." She answered. The scrap referenced the name of my childhood dog, which no one in the county could possibly know. I told myself to leave. People talk about signs as if they are escrow. You give one and nothing happens for the rest of time. I packed once, drove into town, and tried to schedule a pickup. I looked back at the lane and saw, on the side of the road, a small carved wooden bird perched on a stump like a sentinel. When I returned with a truck, the bird had been moved to the porch and left with a stone stamped with a thumbprint. The thumbprint was small and flattened into the stone like a soft fossil of a hand. It got more direct after that. I once blurted into the dark, "If you mean harm, leave." The next morning, I found a folded scrap of paper under the doormat. The words inside were neat and contained 3 things I'd eaten for breakfast the day my mother died. Obsessive, intimate details. Whoever or whatever had been listening did not simply reply. Cataloged. The letter that broke me was not the first direct note. There had been others, but it was the first to be addressed to me by name. I was not in the house the day it appeared. I had run into town for groceries and returned to the sound of the wind playing a tired song across the poplars. The letter was tucked under the trunk lid where the batik cloth lay. The paper was thin and smelled faintly of cedar. In a script that echoed the old letters and yet had the stubbornness of my grandmother's ink, it read, "We hear you put a name to your fear. We now have your attention. Be careful what you ask aloud. Houses listen back because they are used to being talked to." The word "we" was plural. That is the kind of detail that makes your stomach toggle. I burned the trunk that night, an absurd, dramatic pyre of family history and recipes, and felt light for, perhaps, a full 15 minutes. Then the radio, the cheap AM, screeched to life by itself and played one sliver of an old hymn my grandmother used to hum, and I thought about kinetic forces and how home is sometimes merely a body you can no longer claim as only yours. I left the property a week later and found that the carved bird was on the hood of my car when I stepped out. No one could tell me where it had come from. Sometimes I think about going back and unearthing the letters from ash, thinking some logic might survive fire. Mostly I think about the way quiet surfaces can answer. Some places are patient enough to pronounce a reply the moment you whisper the question into them, and the answer is not always what you wanted to hear. Some places listen. Some reply. Most of them don't give you a warning. We rented 3 cabins in a line that hugged a small clearing like teeth around a gum. The idea was to get away in a cluster. Cooking together, the half-privacy of our own spaces, the safety you feel with a few more bodies around the fire. The neighborhood's oddity was a cabin at the far edge of the property that everyone called the empty place. The owner swore it was seasonal, a kind sun story that is how people explain strange habits to each other, something to make the edges less sharp. For the first evening, it was exactly that: corners, laughter, an air of being the same old people who could do small things like roast a marshmallow without recollection. On the second night, someone pointed at the far cabin and noticed a light in the window. We shrugged. Maybe the owner was doing a late inventory, someone joked. He said later he had not been there. Curiosity is an odd engine. That night we dared each other and walked, 3 flashlights cutting the dark, toward the neighbor's place. The porch board was cold under our shoes and the key in the lock turned with the soft compliance of history. The cabin smelled like toast and dust. A plate sat on the table with a half-eaten sandwich and a cup with lip marks. The bed was made in a way that suggested someone had slept and then made it out of habit, as if the bed remembered its own use. On a shelf hung a calendar with a single date circled March 13th and a scrap of paper with a message in a hurried hand. I had to go inside. We looked at each other and felt something that was less surprise and more a sudden reduction of the world to a note. It was a message that belonged to a life that continued without the human part we expected. We took cameras for sport at first, then because we wanted to document the uncanny with the dignity of a file. The motion cams we set outside revealed something small and yet catastrophic to our sense of space. One camera showed the cabin door swinging open at 2:19 a.m. No figure appears in the frame. The door opens wider on a windless night and then closes. The audio recorded nothing but the soft thump of wood. When we went inside at dawn, nothing looked disturbed. A cup with tea turned lukewarm, a magazine on the table, a single glove lying near the hearth. We told the park office. They told us the cabin had belonged to a man who would go for long walks and come back weeks later with no memory of the route. "He's an old fellow with strange habits," they said, as if that explained an empty plate. We tried to rationalize it in the way people on vacation do. Maybe a drunk passed through, maybe the owner had come back and left again. But the footsteps on the porch, tiny and precise, suggested someone living there for short hours and then vanishing. It got worse when we placed a camera inside the neighbor's living room. The footage was grainy and nothing like we'd seen in horror clips. At 3:13 a.m. it captured motion. The kettle steaming on the stove, a chair moving as if someone had just pushed it back, and a handprint fogging the inside of the mirror like someone who'd cupped their palm there and then walked away. No body appeared in the frame. No shadow moved across the doorway. Yet the trace evidence was there, domestic and unsettling. We called the man who owned it and he came by, face soft with concern. He opened the door and looked at his own table and shrugged in that small tragic way of people who will accept the house's choices. "I go to my wood and I don't always remember walking back." He pressed his thumb into his pocket and found, folded and slightly damp, a photograph he did not remember taking. It showed the living room at 3:13 a.m., exactly what our camera captured. He had no memory of being there nor how the kettle had boiled. We left him to his mystery, but at night, when the fire died, and we lay in our cabins with the hum of the forest pressing like a finger, we thought of the neighbor's house as breathing on its own. We thought of how a space can be occupied not by bodies but by a pattern of leaving. It looked like someone had lived in hours too small to be recorded by memory but large enough to be visible on film. The final detail that made us not return the next year came when one of our friends found a small child's shoe under the neighbor's porch, too small for any of us and worn like it had been kept in a pocket. It matched no missing person report in the county. The neighbor said, with a voice that had gone flat in the middle, "I don't keep anyone out. They come and go. The house lets them." That was the peculiar submission he gave us, as if he had always been willing to accept other sovereignties in his living room. We left the shoe with the park and with bites of unanswered questions. When the neighbor finally sold the place 2 years later, he kept the photograph in his pocket and said he would not sleep there again. I drive by sometimes in autumn and see the cabin dark and patient. The idea that a house can be home to comings and goings without bodies, patterns of small, unattended domesticity is the sort of thing that makes you check the windows twice before you sleep. It makes you understand that some neighbors are not neighbors at all. They are the memory of a place that will not stay empty. These were 3 disturbing true-style stories of break-ins, the kind that leave you awake long after the police leave. If you've experienced something similar, email your story to scaredalessamond@gmail.com. Keep names private if you wish. Please subscribe for more true scary stories. Good night.